in for just a wonderful speaker today, and I'd like to take half a second to introduce her. I hope you saw that she was front page in the Daily today, so you can get many more details, and I'm sure Angela will share some of that with you. So Angela Lee Duckworth, the University of Professors, Christopher H. Browne Distinguished Professor of Psychology, and a recipient of the 2013-18 MacArthur Fellowship. In parentheses, it says AKA Genius Award. She is a research psychologist and former math and science teacher who is the scientific director of the not-for-profit school-focused Character Lab, which she founded in 2013 to advance the science and practice of character development in children. Character Lab researchers, designers, and the educators collaborate to solve the mystery of why some people work so much harder and longer than others, what are the character-building ideas and strategies, and creating precise measures of character for research and practical educational tools. One announcement would be that Angela has this book that I hope you've seen in the bookstore. In the author's alcove, she will have a book signing after she speaks here, and it will be up at the bookstore in the author's alcove versus right here. So this is her book. Take a look. Grit. Today, Angela will focus mainly on grit, and she will discuss the context as one of the many character strengths. Would you give her a warm Chautauqua welcome, please?
Thank you. Do I get to hug you? Okay. I'm trying to hug Nancy without disturbing the microphone that's taped to me. I was asking if I could be down there because I don't really like being up here on this stage. I'd rather be closer, but the answer was no, you cannot go down there. So I'll stay up here. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful, I'm honored to be here. I know you've had a series of the most distinguished speakers in the world, so I couldn't be more pleased to share my research today with you on character. And I read the story in your newspaper to find out what I was supposed to be talking about. Wanted to make sure I didn't, screw up and talk about something else. But actually, grit and more generally character, and I'd like to tell you what I mean by character. I think it's a word that means something to all of us, but maybe something different to different people. I think about grit and character and kids pretty much all the time. So I kind of did know what I was going to talk about because I'm going to talk about what is on my mind every morning, every late afternoon, every evening, every night that I go to bed, and when I wake up in the morning to get a drink of water, what is apparently on my mind right then, because I always notice that, wow, it is 4 in the morning, and apparently I am still thinking about this. And in fact, that, just to begin, I think is really characteristic of this quality, this character strength, call it what you will, this attribute of grit. And I study this combination of passion for what you do and the willingness to work really, really hard for it. Passion and perseverance. I study grit because it is a signature characteristic of high achievers in every field that I have studied, be it physical, a la Olympics, which I hope you've been watching every day since it started this summer, and also intellectual fields. So, for example, the many Nobel laureates that you've had grace Chautauqua, I would guess that these are individuals who are deeply passionate about what they do and tremendously persevering. It was a few years ago that I got an email from a close collaborator and a mentor, Jim Heckman. He is an economist at the University of Chicago, and he was emailing me from here, where he was honored to give a talk, and he told me how great it was, and that I should try to shoehorn my way in someday. And when I finally wrote a book, I had an opportunity to do that. But Jim Heckman, like me, thinks about economics all the time. How do I know? Well, like many gritty individuals, there are stories of this kind of crazy in a way, but deeply admirable passion and perseverance. I'll give you one. When I was just in graduate school, I had met Jim. He's really famous. Like, yes, he has a Nobel Prize, but even among the Nobel Prize economists, Jim stands a head taller. He might win the Nobel Prize twice in economics, which would be unprecedented in history. And when I started to work with him, I tried to figure out, how do I work with this individual? Well, he figured out how he wanted to work with me, because it's how he works with anyone. He said, well, I've got a little time. I live in Philadelphia, go Quakers, University of Pennsylvania, and Jim's in Chicago. I knew there would be a smattering of applause for the Quakers. And Jim said, well, I'm flying into Princeton for this meeting, so you should come to this meeting, and I'm getting in pretty late, but we can work when we get in. Well, with flight cancellations and then travel delays, he ended up getting in the morning at about 1 o'clock, so 1 a.m. And he also had walking pneumonia and a few other little details that would make any one of us mortals just like go to bed, right? But I get this text like, are you ready to work? And I was like, yes, and we worked, from 1 in the morning until however long, and then he just was, right there, up and at 'em the next day. And it's that kind of intrinsic passion for what you do. I want to do this. I want to do this at 1 in the morning, flying in from Chicago, with a lot of other things on my mind and not much respiratory capacity because I have walking pneumonia, but I want to do this so much that it is my choice to sit down at a desk with you and work on a paper. So that's what I study. I study this characteristic passion and perseverance for long-term and challenging goals. And I think it's something that we all have in some measure. Most human characteristics, it turns out, are not either-or characteristics. It's not that you're either gritty or you're not gritty. There is a continuum. Jim Heckman is on one far end. Usain Bolt, Michael Phelps, Katie Ledecky, name your favorite Olympian, insert here, right? And then there's, the rest of us at varying levels of passion and perseverance for the long term. And the fun thing, or the maybe wondrous thing about qualities like grit, is that you don't have to be where you started. I believe that grit can be, and actually typically is developed over the lifespan. So I see that in the audience today we have representatives from all stages of the lifespan, including the beginning. So the kids are obviously the most important people in the room. And I can tell you that however passionate and persevering you are, and I'll unpack it a little bit for you, what does that really mean? However you are today doesn't mean that you will grow up to be that way. And in fact, in my data, as it said in the newspaper, I find that age and grit go hand in hand. We tend to be grittier at later ages in life. Now, what is it to be gritty? What is it to get grittier? I'm going to unpack passion for you. It has two components. When somebody says to you, I love what you do, or I love what I do, when they have passion for what they're doing, when they can say that their job is not a job, but a calling. And for a moment, those of you who have worked or are working might say, would I consider my work a calling? They typically can say two further things. They can say that they are intrinsically, deeply interested. It's fun for me to think about this, their work. And they also find it important. So two drivers of passion are interest, and I'll call it importance or purpose. And they're different. And they develop over the lifespan. Interest is what you think about because you want to think about it. It's me waking up at 4 in the morning and thinking about a Shakespeare quote because maybe to be or not to be has a secret that would reveal something about perseverance of effort over time. It's watching a movie and getting distracted a little bit because how does this plot help me understand how children develop? It's Jim Heckman flying in at 1 in the morning and wanting to sit down and talk to me about a paper that he read on the plane. Interest is just a kind of spontaneous gravitation to a topic. And looking at the ages of some of the young people here today, I'll tell you that it is around early adolescence that our interests begin to sharpen a bit. For sure, 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds are interested in things. They're kind of interested in everything. But by the time you're 14 or 15, you're not equally interested in everything. Some things interest you more. Jim Heckman remembers that when he was around 14 or 15, he became very interested in mathematics. It was not coincidental that he grew up to be an economist, and in fact, a kind of economist called an econometrician. Lots of math. And it was around that early adolescent time that he grew more interested in math and, in contrast, less interested in other things. He was less interested in geology, less interested in cooking, less interested in playing a sport. So interest, which is one of the seeds of passion, these interests emerge in our lives with some kind of sharpness around the age of 13, 14, 15 years old. We all have them. There is not a human being who is uninterested in everything. But the thing about the gritty individuals that I study, the paragons of passion and perseverance, is that they don't get bored. Now, this is remarkable because everybody gets bored. Boredom is universal, and it's actually adaptive. It is a good thing to get bored. Boredom comes from being in a situation where you don't feel like you're learning anything. It would be impossible, it seems, at Chautauqua because you're always learning something. But the idea of being passionate is that you don't get bored of this thing that you've been doing for so long. You will be like Will Shortz, the New York Times crossword puzzle editor, whom I studied because he is a paragon of grit. And when I talked to him about puzzles, I said, well, when did you start getting interested? And he said, about the age of 8. So he was a little early, right? Mostly I was expecting, 12, 13. About 8 years old, Will Shortz actually made his first crossword puzzle. And then he started doing puzzles in earnest as an early teen. He actually wrote an essay for his English class saying that he was going to grow up to be a professional puzzle maker, which is so remarkable to me because that profession doesn't exist, right? He was like, I am going to make this. His teacher was amused, but Will proved himself right. And I said to him, well, you've been doing puzzles for really your whole life, if you think about it. I mean, let's just round up and say your entire life. I mean, don't you get bored of like one more crossword puzzle to edit? And he said, I think that if you're bored of puzzles, you must be bored of life. Each one is entirely different. And for those of you who developed a real expertise in your life, maybe a vocation, a teacher, a psychologist, a mathematician, an economist, a coach, whatever it is that you've spent your life honing, or maybe an avocation, gardening, collecting something, you also might tell me, I know exactly what you mean. I'll never get bored of this. There are always new things to discover. And the thing about passion, and particularly the interest facet of passion, is that where it comes from is discovering continually new nuances. And that is something I think we need to help children discover. There is a real attraction to entirely new cat videos that people send you. It's totally new and you haven't seen it before, so you're going to click here and watch this cat video. And then when you get bored of that, someone will send you a different link, or maybe there's a new app and then you'll click there and it's totally new. So you can kind of satiate your appetite for novelty by just one thing after another. But some young people will continue working in a given direction. They'll swim one year, but they'll swim the next year. And maybe they'll swim a third third year. And they'll realize that the freestyle isn't just something that you learn. There are continual nuances. There is constant discovery of what outsiders might think is boring, but you, because you're developing into an expert, you are becoming less and less bored, even though you know more and more. And that's one wish that I have for my own kids who are 13 and 14 years old, and they are just in that stage of interest development. And I would like them to learn that if they keep switching, if they constantly click onto a new hyperlink or a new activity or a new direction, they will never develop that unique appreciation that only experts have for their craft. And they will lose out on this opportunity to discover what it would mean to be like Will Shortz, never bored, because it's always new. So that's one aspect of passion. You cannot be a gritty individual, or at least I haven't encountered one, who isn't intrinsically interested in a deep way in what they do. The second facet of passion is the sense of importance or purpose. And that is different from being spontaneously attracted to something because, well, at 4 a.m, it's kind of what I want to think about. When I say purpose, I mean very specifically feeling like you belong to something greater than yourself. And in fact, most typically feeling that you are serving something bigger than yourself, that in some way what you're doing helps other people. Now this, again, to speak to the younger people in the audience, tends not to emerge until later in adulthood. Rare is the 12-year-old who is thinking very broadly about how they can serve the rest of humanity. However, awesome is the 12-year-old who's doing that. But it typically happens actually a little later on, after you've actually gotten pretty good at something. But what's striking to me is that when you interview people who should be like that, like community arts activists, I interviewed in Philadelphia, she is reputedly the single grittiest person in the entire city, Jane Golden. She single-handedly made it possible for now 4,000 murals to be on the walls of Philadelphia. And you can only imagine the red tape and the bureaucracy and the fundraising and the little squabbles and the big battles that she had to go through to do all this. Well, she should be somebody who exemplifies purpose, other-centered, beyond the self-purpose, because after all, she's a community arts activist. So when I met people like her, I thought, okay, obviously some gritty people will be motivated by other-centered purpose. But as I conducted these interviews with people who had kind of self-interested vocations, at least from the outside, athletes, for example, in individual sports, I mean, the gold medal goes around their neck. It's not obviously an other-centered, beyond the self vocation. When you interview those athletes, they will tell you without exception that when I swim, it's important to me to know that my performance matters to other people, sometimes to my mom, sometimes to my kid's sister, sometimes to the other team members on the swim team, even if it's an individual medley, it's not a medley, it's an individual sprint, sometimes to the sport at large. But I haven't yet met the paragon of grit whose passion doesn't come both from this is interesting to me, but also from this is important to other people. And I think it's something that we shouldn't wait to tell our kids about, because even if developmentally they're still at the interest stage and aren't old enough to fully appreciate that life is best lived in the service of others, it's something that they should look forward to. Because even the world-renowned wine taster, Antonio Galloni, whom I interviewed as a paragon of grit, said that that's what drives him. He had just gotten back from wine tasting in the Bordeaux region of France, and I said, well, that's a tough life. And he's like, well, yeah, it was actually pretty hard because, I'm really developing my palate for the Bordeaux's, and I tried to be sympathetic to him. But I did ask him, he is a nice guy, but I did ask him, what drives you? And he said, I know this sounds crazy. I kind of can't believe it's coming out of my mouth, but I mean, I'm not a I'm not a cancer researcher, I don't do charitable work in the conventional sense, but I really feel driven by a sense of mission. When people can discover their wine palates, when they can appreciate wine as part of their life, it's like a light bulb goes off for me. And my mission in life is to make 1 million light bulbs go off. That's purpose. That is beyond the self-purpose. The wine comes later, guys, for the younger people, again, in the audience, to tailor the remarks. So when I study grit, I mean this combination of passion and perseverance. And when you ask, where does the passion come from? Why don't I have enough? It's possibly because you haven't deepened your interest. And if you're not 14, you might try to remember who you were when you were 14, because that's when those interests started to take shape. When I think about when I was 14, I realized that I was getting interested in people. I was watching the other kids in my class, and I was finding it interesting that one person would be more popular than another person. Why would that person be popular? Why did he say it that way? Why is she crying? That was the early sign that I was growing interested in psychology. When I was 16 and I had the choice of taking any summer school class at all, I chose psychology. That's important. That was a sign. But if you had asked me when I was 14 or 16 or even 18 or 22 or 24 or 28 or 31, Angela, what are you passionate about? I would say, oh my gosh, I don't know. And that's the funny thing about interest. So for the parents in the audience and the grandparents in the audience, you might actually have more of a sense of the emerging interests in the young people that you so love than they do. Because the funny thing about interests is that you're not necessarily conscious of their development in you while they're in their early stages. My own daughter, Lucy, she would rush home. She's now 13, but even when she was, 9 years old, probably younger, she would rush home and she would want to watch those YouTube videos about decorating cupcakes, and she would want to read cookbooks. And every Friday, she would bake something new. And all week, she would talk about what she was going to bake on that Friday. And one day I said to her, Lucy, it seems like you're interested in baking. And she said, no. Why would you say that? I was like, I don't know, because you are looking at baking books, and she's like, no, I'm not really interested in it. Now she realizes. So if you have a grandchild or a child, your job, I think, is to vigilantly watch for these emerging interests and to provide the opportunities for those interests to grow, and maybe to provide a little discipline, because when your child says, yeah, but next year I'm going to do something totally different, you might encourage them gently to go a little deeper, so they can discover what it means to become sort of expert at something, kind of excellent, to come home and know some things about their sport or their community service club or their subject that you don't know at dinner time. Because this is that age where they develop those interests into things that could sustain them and their curiosity for a lifetime. At the same time, should you have a young person in your life, one could gently suggest that no matter what it is that you do, as long as it's legal, there has to be somebody who benefits, right? And I think that's actually a wonderful thing for a young person to discover. One of my colleagues, David Yeager at University of Texas, did a random assignment study recently. It was a purpose intervention. And what David did was he divided teenagers up into two groups. Half of them more or less got school as usual. And half of them wrote a very, very short little reflection about something in the world that they cared about, something about other people's welfare. And kids wrote different things. Some kids were very concerned about the melting polar ice caps, and some kids were worried about poverty, and some kids were worried about politics, and some kids were worried about very local things like their families' issues. And then the writing reflection exercise prompted them to just very gently, very kind of heavy-handed way, like, what is it that being a student could maybe help you with that purpose? The work that you do as a kid, how could it in some way help with those melting polar ice caps? Like, what is it that you could do? That was the whole intervention, just reflecting for a moment on how you are not just a 14-year-old out for yourself. to make a better living, etc., but that what you do is connected to other people, that you matter, that other people need you. And what David found in that random assignment study is that kids were much more engaged in their work. They voluntarily took on things like extra credit assignments, and actually, they even earned better marks. So I think it's never too early to begin to appreciate the power of other-centered purpose, even if its full flourishing is usually waiting for us at a more mature stage of life. So if you would like to be a little more passionate, my suggestion is to probe your interests, see if you can get a little deeper, and to strengthen those connections that you have with other people, because no matter who it is, somebody needs you. Now, what about perseverance? That's the kind of more obvious side of grit. It's what the word grit sounds like. Perseverance, John Wayne, or if you're a little younger, the other True Grit movie that did not have John Wayne, but it was basically the same story, right? And I would say that it's not just a matter of willpower. The first thing that science can tell you about things like perseverance is that they're not these mysterious qualities of the will that some people have and some people don't. Perseverance, I think, comes in two forms in the people that I study. Lowercase p, perseverance, and uppercase P, perseverance. I feel like I should stand over here for the people who probably haven't been able to see me behind the podium. I'm only 5'1". I apologize for my short stature. So passion was over there, and perseverance will be over here. So the lowercase perseverance, the lowercase p, the daily perseverance, which I find to be more remarkable than anything about gritty individuals, is really working at your chosen goal like a craftsman. The 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had a debate with his sometimes friend, sometimes enemy, Wagner. They were like frenemies, and they were debating genius. And Wagner said, "You are a genius, Nietzsche. I read your work, and you have something special that nobody else has, and it was born in you. It was an innate talent." And Nietzsche said, "Speak not to me of inborn gifts. Speak not to me of the talents that are natural. I don't believe that they exist. Because the truly great ones in every domain approach their work like a craftsman, and they work diligently at each of the many components of what they do. They sand and buff and polish each one so that the overall effect is dazzlingly spectacular. But they are, at the end of the day, workmen, craftsmen." And so this idea that to be persevering in the gritty sense is really to work on those weaknesses that you have, those small elements of what you do, daily, consistently. That is the remarkable thing about gritty individuals. What does it actually look like? Take any Olympic athlete. You see them for 25 seconds, and then you don't see them again for 4 years. But what you really need to be admiring is they're waking up at 4:30 in the morning when it is completely dark out and put on their shorts or their bathing suit and walk to the gym or the pool and to go through their exercises again, usually on their own because the coach is not necessarily there at 4:30 in the morning, over and over again, working specifically on tiny little aspects of their overall performance so that 4 years later, it might become a dazzling, spectacular whole. And after those 25 seconds, you might turn to the person next to you on the couch, and you might say, "Wow, what a natural talent. What genius." And you should remember what Nietzsche said. Maybe it was all those hours of toil that are invisible to the rest of us. There is actually a science of skill development, and my colleague Anders Ericsson, he's a psychologist at Florida State University. He spent his entire life studying Olympic athletes and world-class chess masters, prima ballerinas, and what he's discovered is that the method, the craft of becoming a genius is actually fairly straightforward. And I think each and every one of us can do some measure of it. What you do when you practice like an expert is you fractionate your overall job into tiny, tiny, tiny little parts. So you don't go to work and you say, "Oh, I'm going to I'm going to be a better accountant today. No, you take some tiny aspect of your job, one thing that you could do a little better, and you intentionally work on it that day. This is the same with athletes. Katie Ledecky does not go to the pool and say, I am just going to swim faster. She works on micro aspects of her technique very intently, very thoughtfully. I like to call it sometimes problem-solving practice because there's a real intention. And Anders Ericsson will tell you that when you interrupt an expert in what they're doing and you say, what are you working on right now? They can tell you. Not like my kids who sometimes when they come home and they're doing homework and I say, so what are you doing right now? And they say, I'm doing page 32, the evens. And I say, yes, but surely Mr. Taranta had an intention. There's probably some specific aspect of your overall math skill that he's working on. What do you think that might be? And when they stare at me blankly and they say, page 32 evens, I know they're not doing the kind of practice that real experts do. Recently, I've been talking a lot with Roberto Diaz. He's the president of Curtis, the music academy in Philadelphia that is roughly twice as competitive for entry as Juilliard. And when he practices with his young musicians, he always asks them to do the what and the why before they, as he puts it, open the case, because he's a violist. So before you open your viola case, tell me the what and the why. The what is what you're going to practice. It's page 37 evens or whatever. I'm going to play the first 4 stanzas of this. But the why is the intention. And if you cannot tell Mr. Diaz what you are playing, but also why you are practicing that, what specific aspect of your overall performance are you really working on, then he will not practice with you. Because the what and the why of practice are prerequisite. You must be working with intention on some tiny aspect of your overall performance. Now, that's not enough. You have to pay attention. You have to focus. You have to, for lack of a better word, try. So, when my kids are texting and Snapchatting while they are doing their math homework, I know they are not practicing like an expert, because experts do not do more than one thing when they are practicing. Interestingly, Anders finds that world-class experts often take a nap after their practice. It is often the case that they can't sustain more than 1 hour of intense physical or intellectual activity without taking a break. And for young children, I asked Anders to come over for dinner one day a few years ago, so my kids were a little younger, late elementary school, and I said, Anders, how much deliberate practice, which is the technical term, how much practice like an expert should these kids be doing? And he said, I don't know, how about 5 minutes? Could they do 5 minutes of really focused, goal-directed, problem-solving, intentional practice? It was not the answer that I expected. And when I took Lucy, the younger of my daughters, to Curtis Music Academy for a one-on-one lesson with Roberto Diaz, and I asked him, Mr. Diaz, how much practice should Lucy be doing on viola? And he looked at her and he said, well, she seems very motivated. And I said, yeah, she's pretty motivated. She's my kid. He said, Lucy, could you do 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes of real practice? And she nodded. That is the high quality kind of engagement that I'm talking about. Not mindless, more homework, more drills, silly things that occupy kids' time that are not worthwhile, that are not goal-directed, that are not going to get them better at anything. Just high-quality practice. So you have this intention, and now you're really focusing. You've turned your cell phone off. You've put it in a different room. You've decided that you are going to do that 10 minutes of focused practice. There's a third thing. You need feedback. If you don't get feedback on what you do, if you shoot baskets but somebody doesn't let you see whether it went in or not, if you play music but you put sound canceling headphones on so you can't hear, then you don't get better. This, by the way, is why we don't get better singing in the shower, I think, because you can't really, it's just like amplified, you can't really hear yourself, and so you can keep singing, but you're not going to be a better singer. You need feedback, and here's the thing, and this is why it's so hard. If you've really chosen to do something that you can't yet do, and you're really trying, the thing is about that feedback, is a lot of it's going to be negative feedback. It's going to be what you didn't quite get right. It's not praise. So that, I think, is something that kids need to learn, that if you want to get better at something, you're going to have to get feedback, and it's not going to be raucous applause all the time. It's going to be, wow, that topic sentence means nothing to me, or what is the point of this paragraph? Because I, as a reader, can't find one. Or, no, you actually got all 7 of those problems wrong. Yeah, all 7 of them. And that feedback should hopefully be immediate and informative. So for those of you with kids or grandkids, think to yourself, in the schoolwork that they do and in the activities that they do, how immediate and informative is the feedback that they get? Because if it's not immediate and it's not informative, then your kids are not practicing the way experts do. Finally, you have to reflect on the feedback, and you have to have the courage to change something and do it all over again. I'll give you one specific example, and then I'll move on to uppercase P, perseverance, and then we'll take some questions. So my example comes from my book tour. I was giving talks all over the country, and I was in Chicago at a high school giving a talk to a crowd about this size, but all teachers. And afterwards, the principal wrote me an email, and he said, I loved what you said about practicing like an expert and feedback. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's great. And he said, well, I have some feedback for you. And immediately, I could feel my palms go sweaty, and I tensed up a little because I knew he was going to say something he didn't like. And that's the way we all feel when somebody tells us about, oh, you know, the chicken, a little underdone. If you could, yeah, that was. We all feel defensive because we're all human. So I felt that way, and I almost deleted the email, but I had the courage to read the rest of it. And he said, you know, when you're talking to teachers and you start your sentences with things like, well, teachers should, or schools ought to, it can be a little condescending. And my immediate reaction was, condescending? I'm 5'1", for God's sakes. How could I be condescending? I came all the way to Chicago to talk to your teachers in this auditorium. What about that is condescending? And then I realized after a moment that he was right. Because when someone tells you that you're condescending, they must be right. They're the audience. They're just telling you how it fell on their ears. So I wrote this principal back and I said, well, do you have any suggestions for me? I mean, how do I be less condescending? Because it wasn't my intention. And he gave me some great examples. He was like, well, why don't you tell some stories about when you were a teacher and how you screwed up? And I said, well, I've got a load of those. And he said, start with them. Illustrate it with your own example. And he had a few more suggestions. So when you practice like an expert, you think, what is one thing that I could do better? Not everything, but one thing. Am I really going to try? Let me turn off the cell phone and engage. Not forever, but just for maybe a few minutes. Let me really give it all I've got. Now let me make sure that there's feedback, somebody telling me the honest truth about what I did great and what I could do better. And then let me have the courage to practice like an expert and make an adjustment and go in the next time and do it a little differently, which is exactly what I did. And I hope I was a little less condescending the next time I addressed a group of educators. So that's lowercase p, perseverance, and it happens in the dark sometimes. It happens, as every coach tells me, when nobody is looking. Excellence in some ways is invisible. Can you practice when nobody is looking? That, I think, is something that we can teach our young people to do. Lowercase p, perseverance, is one thing. What about this uppercase P, perseverance? I think we need to be, on occasion, but maybe not every day, resilient. We have to get up again. There's this wonderful expression in Japanese, fall 7, rise 8. I love that expression because it tells us that there is no path in life that is completely smooth. Now, you don't need this every day because it's not like setbacks and failures and catastrophes happen every day, I hope. But if you really try something that's worth doing in life, there will be times where your resolve is tested. And there's a science of resilience as well. And in a nutshell, it goes like this. A lot of our feelings of hope and optimism, and I can do it, a lot of that resolve comes from our thoughts. It comes from thoughts like, I can do something here. It's not beyond my own ability to change this situation. And where those thoughts come from are deeply held beliefs. In particular, my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford has been studying for about 30 years one belief that she thinks is enormously important for almost everything that we do that has to do with grit. And it is a growth mindset. Some of you may have heard of growth mindset already because Carol's becoming more famous than Freud, which makes me happy because I'm pretty sure she's way nicer than Freud, from what I can tell, reading the biographies and knowing her. So what Carol Dweck will say is that some of you in this audience have more of a fixed mindset about your abilities. There are some people who are great speakers, and there are some people like Hillary Clinton who are not natural public speakers. There are some people who are natural athletes, and some kids who just are, they're just not coordinated. I'm a math person, but my wife, sorry to say, I love her, but she's not a math person. If those statements resonate with you, Carol would say you have a very developed fixed mindset about abilities. You think they're pretty permanent, that they're just who you are. On the other hand, you might have what Carol calls a growth mindset, and that is the deep down conviction, the assumption that human beings are continually changing and growing in every way, including their intelligence, including their ability. We have a common colleague, another Stanford professor, and he often would say to me in conversation while we were working on a really hard paper, he would say, Angela, can you send me those papers that you just mentioned? Because I'd like to get smarter on that kind of statistic. And I always thought it was a phrase that was so weird, like, sure, I'll send them to you so you can get smarter. Like, what would that even mean to get smarter? And then I realized he was being very intentional because he really believes you can get smarter about anything, that maybe you won't be Einstein or Katie Ledecky or Usain Bolt, but your abilities can grow, that talent in some very meaningful sense is malleable. So if you are looking for uppercase P perseverance, the fail 7, keep trying 8 kind of perseverance that on occasion every single one of us needs, you might catalog your thoughts. Is the thought that crosses your mind, I can't do this, it's ruined, it's a disaster, I'm a loser? Okay, well, if you have those kind of thoughts, you're like a lot of people, but underlying those thoughts is a belief, a kind of global belief that maybe human nature is fixed, not malleable. And you might work on that belief, and you might say, there's a lot of evidence from neuroscience that all throughout life, at every stage, every single one, we continually grow and learn. The brain is never done sculpting and improving. Human beings are learning machines. And so, sure, I may not be very extroverted or charismatic, or maybe I don't cook well or dance well, but that doesn't mean that those abilities might not evolve, might not grow, that I might in fact be a different person if you came back and visited with me in some years. So I study grit, one aspect of character, which I'll end with this final note. I study passion and perseverance because I think you can reverse engineer any character strength. There is not a dimension of human functioning that I think is completely inaccessible and necessarily mysterious. We can find great admiration in watching Usain Bolt run or Katie Ledecky swim, but we shouldn't say, yeah, but I'll never be Katie Ledecky, because in some ways we could be a little bit like Katie Ledecky, and we might say, wow, where did her passion come from? And where did she learn to be so persevering? Oh, she had that experience. Oh, she believes in that. Oh, there is a habit that I could emulate. I believe, as Aristotle believed, that character is every aspect of our being that benefits ourself and benefits other people. And like Aristotle, I believe that character never stops developing, and that there is so much that we can do to develop our own character, and very importantly, the character of the young people that we love. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Per Chautauqua tradition, I start on this side, yes?
Well, I'm proud to say I came here with pneumonia. Have you ever heard of the Jesters, which was a musical?
I have not.
They were a musical group in the 50s who wrote all about character development through song. I can still sing those songs today. My question to you is, do you think it's efficacious for children to learn things through rhyme and song?
Yes. Here's a short answer, yes. And here's just a slightly more elaborated answer, but I'll try to be succinct. I have a friend named Lisa New. She's a professor of English at Harvard University, and she believes that poetry changes people. And I, being a scientist and a daughter of a scientist, thought like, yeah, that sounds good, but really? But I'll tell you that in recent months, I have been trying to commit certain poems to memory. And I'm doing that in part because a couple of the very gritty coaches that I've been studying make their team players memorize quotes and poems and commit them to memory and be able to say them out loud because they feel like it will change them. And so far, I've got the first stanza of Rudyard Kipling's poem, If, down, and it has helped me enormously because when I said that, you know, your feelings of hope and resolve come from your thoughts and your thoughts come from your beliefs, you could sort of wander around in the dark with your own, you know, best shot at what you should be thinking, or you could recite the words of Rudyard Kipling and it will, in your bones, you know, be a thought that actually you were thinking, but not quite so eloquently. And I think it can kind of give you a direction and an inspiration that you wouldn't have had. So, yes. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Hi.
I work for a company I won't mention years and years ago that we had an expression about he or she was gritty. Usually they were a pain in the ass, but they were also our best scientists and researchers and electronics designers. So my question is, I listen to you in complete awe at the concept and the way you outline it is, what do we grandparents and parents do to think about our children in the context not only of what we can influence, but also public education or private education?
I'll give you one very specific suggestion because there are many, but one thing you learn from studying experts is that their coaches are very good and they don't give their players 17 suggestions because you can, after all, only practice one thing at a time. So I'll give you one suggestion. I think that the time that kids spend outside of the classroom may be where most of them really begin to develop their passions. So sure, a few of them will be in love with Latin class and then they will go to Swarthmore, and God bless them. But so many children are much more interested in the sports they're playing, or frankly, the team building that happens when you're in a sport, or leadership, or giving out books at the library on Saturdays. There are so many things that our young people can and should do outside of the first bell to the last bell academic curriculum. Now, what I see in this country is less and less focus on those other, you know, things that you don't see on a standardized achievement test, and that is a shame. But even more than that, the areas where this is really being diminished are low-income areas, where I think often with good intention, educators are so hell-bent on getting their kids to do well on these tests that they practically eliminate all the things that for some of us drew us to school in the first place. How many of us looked forward to gym class and art class and music class and that activity that happened at 3:30? Those hardly exist in low-income schools. So what we find in our data is that kids who participate in extracurricular activities, particularly over sustained periods, not just 1 year, but 2 years, with some kind of depth, those are the kids who are the grittiest, and when you follow those kids into young adulthood, those are the kids who are really thriving. So I hope that what we can do for our own children, but for the children who are not our direct kids, but of course all of our kids, is that we provide those other opportunities to develop passion and to learn perseverance outside the classroom.
Professor, you make me proud to be a Penn alum.
I hope you were clapping when you gave a shout out to the Quakers.
When I was there, Ben Franklin was walking around the campus. But my question is, you're talking to an affluent, informed audience here who love their children and love their grandchildren and do anything to make them succeed. Suppose you were talking to an inner city group of folks single parents, grandparents who are taking care of their grandchild because the parents are not there. What would you tell them?
It's such a great question, and let me tell you, the Character Lab is this nonprofit. I had 2 co-founders. They needed to make my name founder for it looked better or something, but really there were 3 of us, and 2 of them were educators, and there was me, a former educator, but really a psychologist. Now, one of them is the headmaster of Riverdale Country School. Some of you have probably heard of Riverdale. Not a low-income community, actually. I think it's actually top 10 tuitions for the country, which means it's got to be like top 10 tuitions for the world. It's a beautiful place where very privileged students attend. That's one of the educators. The other educator was Dave Levin, whose KIPP charter schools serve 99.5% or something like low-income kids whose families, they qualify for free lunch in the schools. And what's interesting is that in some very fundamental ways, kids from Riverdale and kids from KIPP are just the same. For example, when we give kids in middle school at Riverdale or at KIPP blank pieces of paper, and we ask them about things like grit and self-control, and just to write in sentences or sort of sentences, what it looks like in their life, there's remarkable overlap. Not 100% overlap, but I really think in some very fundamental ways, kids are kids are kids. Similar worries, similar concerns, similar challenges. Now, of course, there are ways in which kids are not living the same lives, and in particular, what we know from my own research and many others is that negative life events that happen to you, not that you're responsible for them, but your parents get divorced, or somebody in your family loses their job, or when you're talking about the neighborhoods that you mentioned, somebody dying. I mean, like, it happens. I mean, somebody getting shot, maybe that in your family, maybe somebody you're just walking by. These extraneous or these exogenous, these outside negative life events, they set off a chain reaction. There's a physiological stress response that happens in kids that probably back in evolutionary time, the Pleistocene era, was adaptive because you want your, fight or flight system to be engaged when you are being threatened. But what happens when you are a kid growing up in a bad part of town is that you have chronic activation of the fight or flight response. You are more impulsive. You are not thinking about long-term goals. You are acting emotionally, sometimes violently. And that, I think, is a real difference between privileged children's lives and kids who are growing up in poverty. So there does have to be something special said to kids who have that as a reality. What I will finally say is this. I think that really the ultimate aim is to figure out what are the things that all children need, and then what are the things that some children especially need. And one of the clues that I have, but it's just a clue, so I'll have to come back in a few years if you want to know what we found, is that I think that a lot of the kids who are struggling academically and socially, who come from circumstances that none of our children will grow up in, is that they have assets, they have strengths, they have capabilities that they haven't figured out how to transfer. So if you talk to a kid who's been like serving her younger sister breakfast every morning at 5 before she somehow gets on the bus herself and takes a 2-hour trip across town so you can show up in the morning, maybe a little sleep deprived, maybe without her homework, and you think, wow, that is a capable child. Why can't you work on this algebra problem with me? Or how come you haven't filled out this application that I brought to you in hard copy 3 times? It's a matter of transferring those assets from one domain to the other. Human beings are remarkably bad at transfer. So there are, for example, remarkable athletes who do not transfer their grit to non-athletic domains. It is possible, and there are examples of transfer, but as a default, human beings do not transfer assets. So one promising lead, as it were, is to take those kids from the most challenging backgrounds and not only teach them some new stuff, but show them the old stuff that they already know how to do, but show them how to transfer it into other domains. Great. Hi.
Hi. So my question is about Little P, and you talked about getting into like a zone and doing like 5 minutes or a short amount of really concentrated activity, whatever the activity is, and then feedback. So my question is about like when you get that feedback. So let's say I'm shooting free throws, and I shoot free throws, and then my coach says, all right, your fingers coming off the wrong way. Like, does your research, or is there a general explanation, like, do you go right back at it then, or do you let it stew and sit and then improve upon it later?
So in general, feedback is best immediately because you have the mental model in your mind of what you just did. So for example, those of you who want to give me feedback on this talk, you could be a little slower next time, you could be a little faster next time. You could give it to me in a year or even a month, and I will try to remember what I was doing at Chautauqua, and I will try to improve. But if you give it to me right away, painful as it may be, I will be able to match it to this thing in my head. So in general, immediate feedback is better. The exception I already alluded to, you have to have the emotional state to be able to really listen to it. So when I get rejected from scientific journals, which I get rejected from 2 times out of 3 when I apply, I can either read the full 9-page single-space review about how exactly I'm an idiot right then and there, or when I see the first line that says, "we regret to," I'm like, all right, print it out, put it in a drawer, I'll read it tomorrow. Because, yeah, it would be good if it were immediate, but I'm so mad right now that I can't process. So as immediate as possible emotionally. Yeah, and I'll be watching maybe 2 more. Is that okay? Great.
Hi, Angela. I'm a superintendent of a small rural district right here in Chautauqua County, and we've been very inspired by your work with the Character Lab and implementing a lot of character interventions in our school. And we see a visible change in our students every day. And my question revolves around, what is the future of the measurement of non-cognitive skills, and how can we get policymakers to see that, our school district still remains at the bottom in terms of those state test scores, but we're spending an equal effort on mastery of academic content, the character piece, and the high-quality work. So if we're spending all this time on this, how can we get them to understand that that's important equally?
So I'll say there's really 2 kinds of important people in the room, the kids and the educators, right? The rest of us are just like filler. So thank you for that question. I think that there is an expression I've heard, what gets measured gets treasured, right? And the educators are like, oh yeah, that's definitely our life. I think 2 things. One is, it's absolutely true that we need to get better at measuring stuff like grit, in part so we can know that some schools are doing a really great job, and in part so that kids can get some feedback. Like I said, this practicing like an expert requires feedback. It would be probably useful to know how you are doing on things like grit, or curiosity, kindness, etc., things that I would consider to be character. On the other hand, and here's the second thing, I am so worried about how good we are at screwing up everything in education policy, that the idea that grit predicts life outcomes can quickly spin out of control into, as it has in California, kids taking these fakeable questionnaires like mine, and then their teachers being held accountable for those scores. And I don't think that's a very positive direction for a bajillion reasons. So I believe that we should advance measures, and I should work on them, and I should work on them with you, and so forth. But we have to be super, super careful that they're not used in the wrong way. And I found generally that policymakers know nothing about kids or measurement. So it's like the perfect storm. I was like, well, first of all, it doesn't seem to me that you have even seen a kid, and just the way you talk about them. And then secondly, you seem also not to know anything about measurement, because when you talk about them, you make it sound like we know how to do it, and we don't. So that's my caution. So some optimism and some hesitation at the same time. Okay, maybe last question, because I want to end on time, but I'll see you at what should I say? I will see you at the bookstore. Okay, last question here, yeah.
2 questions. One really quick one. Did Lucy choose the viola to begin with?
Yeah, the quick answer is yes, because in our family we have a hard thing rule. You have to do something where you practice like an expert, even when you were little, even if it were for 1 minute. Second thing is you can't quit in the middle. So you can't quit in the middle of track season, even though you were 8th out of 8 people in the last meet. And you can't quit ballet, even though you decided you don't want to be a ballerina, until the semester is up. So have to do a hard thing, can't quit in the middle. But the third rule, or the third part of the hard thing rule in our family, which we followed from day 1, is nobody gets to choose your hard thing but you. And I think that's what makes this philosophy a little bit different from the Tiger Mom philosophy. I have not interviewed a single paragon of have grit who was forced into what they were doing. Because when you wake me up at 4 in the morning, it is not because someone told me to be thinking about grit and psychology, it's because I want to.
So then, do you have any effective strategies for incentive to choose a hard thing? That's what I have a hard time with.
I mean, I did say this to my kids. When I discovered that on their own they weren't going to pick one, that's when we instituted this rule. We're like, it's not a choice whether you do something hard, but I will give you a choice what you do that's hard. And I do think it's important to recognize that, you're fighting with like Instagram, Snapchat, flaming hot Cheetos, video games that just get better and better every day. And I think that without some parental or grandparental encouragement and frankly some discipline in the psychologically wise way that you will do it, I think it's necessary. I don't think most children will be like, I'm going to go practice my viola for 40 minutes now, and then I will, they do need some rules, but I think as much autonomy as you can give your kids within those boundaries, really, choice is great. People, when they choose to do something, it is a world apart from when you make them do it. So as much choice as you can give them. And the second thing and the final thing I'll say is this. I think that as much as I've, loved talking to adult audiences, I like talking to kids more because they're just as smart as you are, if not smarter. And they can understand everything that you can understand. So if there's a reason for your rule, if you're like, well, the reason I want you to do that, tell them, have a conversation. It's completely different when you just lay down the law than when you explain your reasoning. Thank you so much for your attention. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.